The first thing people get wrong about ranch work is how much of it is just checking things. You check gates, you check fences, you check whether a cow has managed to injure itself on something that has been sitting in the same field for 20 years. And during summer, you check water. I was 24 and working temporarily on a cattle ranch in eastern New Mexico. The owner, Dale, had messed up his shoulder and needed somebody to handle the more remote parts of the property until he recovered. It was decent money, and I needed it. Most mornings started before sunrise. By noon, it could be over 100 degrees, and the ground would get hot enough that you could feel it through your boots. The ranch was enormous, not movie ranch enormous, with a mansion and perfect horses. It was mostly dry land, old fencing, scattered cattle, and water systems held together by repairs from 3 different decades. The farthest tank was called Number 6. It sat nearly 7 miles from the main house, beyond a low ridge where the radio stopped working properly. It supplied water to around 70 cattle, so during a heat wave, it wasn't something you could ignore. The first time, I found it nearly empty. I assumed a float valve had stuck. That was common. I cleaned it, checked the pipe, waited for the water level to rise, then moved on. The next morning, it was low again. Not completely dry, but far lower than it should have been. There was no leak around the tank. The ground wasn't muddy. The pipe was still running. I counted the cattle twice. 71. They couldn't have used that much water overnight. Dale thought that I had misread the level. He didn't say it in a rude way. He just had that tone older guys use when they think you're making a simple job more complicated than it needs to be. So that evening, I marked the water line with a piece of chalk. The next morning, it had dropped almost 2 feet. The chalk mark was still there. That bothered me, not because it was scary, because it meant I had a problem I couldn't explain, and cattle don't care whether a problem makes sense. I spent most of that morning checking the line. No broken pipe, no wet ground, no damaged valve. The tank itself was fine. Then I noticed a flattened strip in the grass behind the windbreak. It was subtle, just a narrow trail where something had been dragged repeatedly. It led away from the tank toward a dry creek bed. I followed it maybe 50 yards before finding the hose. Black rubber, half buried under dust and weeds. One end was attached beneath the tank's overflow pipe. Whoever had installed it knew enough to keep it out of sight from the normal approach. The hose continued down into the creek bed. I should have gone back and told Dale. Instead, I followed it. That sounds stupid, but at that point, I was mostly angry. Somebody had been stealing water during the hottest week of the year and leaving me responsible for 70 thirsty animals. The creek bed curved behind a sandstone rise. On the other side was an old livestock shelter I hadn't known existed. 3 walls, rusted roof, mostly hidden from the ranch road. There were 2 large plastic water containers inside, the kind people mount on trailers. One was nearly full. There were fuel cans, tools, several coolers, and a stack of vehicle batteries along the back wall. None of it belonged to the ranch. The place didn't look like a camp. It looked organized. That was when I stopped feeling angry and started feeling like I had walked into somebody else's business. I backed out without touching anything. Halfway up the creek bed, I heard an engine. Not from the ranch road, from somewhere behind the shelter. I dropped down beside the bank before I even thought about it. An old utility vehicle came around the sandstone rise with 2 men in it. Neither of them looked like ranch hands. One wore a long-sleeved shirt despite the heat. The other had a bandana over the lower half of his face, probably because of the dust. They stopped near the shelter. I could hear them moving equipment around, metal scraping, a cooler lid opening. Then one of them walked towards the hose. I was maybe 60 yards away, lying against hot dirt with grass scratching my neck. My radio was useless down there. My phone had no signal, and nobody expected me back for several hours. That was the moment the size of the ranch finally became real to me. I had spent weeks enjoying the isolation. Now, it meant I could shout until I lost my voice and nobody would hear me. One of the men reached the tank connection and swore, "I have found the part I had uncovered." The other man came over. They spoke quietly for a while. I couldn't make out most of it, but I heard enough. Someone had been checking the tank. They wanted to know whether it was the old man or the new kid. I was the new kid. They already knew about me. I stayed flat against the bank while they walked around above me. At one point, loose dirt rolled down close enough to hit my sleeve. I don't know whether they saw my tracks. The creek bed was hard and rocky, but I had definitely left some. Eventually, the utility vehicle started again. The sound moved away from the shelter, but not towards the road. It circled somewhere behind the rise. I waited, 5 minutes, then 10. The heat was getting bad. The dirt beneath me felt like a stove. I kept imagining them sitting somewhere quiet with the engine off, waiting for me to stand. After maybe 20 minutes, I crawled in the opposite direction. I followed the creek bed for almost a mile before climbing out near a fence line. From there, I walked back towards the main ranch road. I didn't return to my ATV. That was the part Dale couldn't understand later. I left it beside the water tank with the keys in my pocket and walked almost 6 miles through the heat because I was convinced somebody would be waiting near it. By the time I reached a ridge where the radio worked, I was out of water and shaking badly enough that I had to use both hands to press the call button. Dale contacted the sheriff. They went out that evening. The shelter had been cleared. The containers, tools, batteries, everything was gone. The hose had been cut into sections and left in the creek bed. My ATV was still beside the tank. Nothing had been stolen from it, but both front tires had been punctured through the sidewalls. Not nails, knife cuts. The sheriff thought the site was being used to store property stolen from farms and construction sites. They found tire tracks leading onto neighboring land, but no vehicles and no people. Nobody was arrested. Dale replaced the tires, moved me to work closer to the house, and mostly avoided talking about what happened. A few days later, I went through the old maintenance shed looking for a new padlock. Inside one drawer was a ring of spare keys. House keys, equipment keys, gate keys. Most of them had handwritten tags. I recognized the names of nearby ranches. There were at least 12, and underneath them, there was one key tagged with the number of our ranch. The brass was dull, and the teeth were worn smooth from use. Whoever had been stealing water hadn't just discovered our property during that heat wave. They had already had a key for years. The stranger asked when my next radio check was due before he asked for water. That was the detail I kept coming back to afterward. Not what he looked like, not where he came from. That question. I was 27 and volunteering at a desert endurance race in southern Utah. It was one of those events where people willingly pay money to run for hours through heat, rocks, and dust. My assignment was Checkpoint 7. It consisted of a canopy, 2 folding tables, water containers, medical supplies, and a satellite radio that worked when it felt like it. The checkpoint was 14 miles from the nearest paved road. Runners reached it after crossing a long stretch of open desert, then continued through a canyon towards the final section. There were supposed to be 2 volunteers. The other guy became sick that morning and was taken back to base. Race control offered to replace him, but by then, the first runners were already approaching. Moving somebody out would have taken over an hour. I told them I could manage. That was my first mistake. My second was assuming that because the race had maps, tracking devices, and support teams, I wasn't really alone. I was. For long stretches, there was nobody within miles. The front runners came through before noon, then small groups every 20 or 30 minutes. By late afternoon, the gaps became much longer. I started counting cups and reading the same page of a paperback over and over. The stranger appeared around 5. He walked in from the west. The race trail came from the north. He wasn't dressed like a runner. No bib, no hydration pack, no hat, just dusty jeans, work boots, and a light-colored shirt. He didn't look exhausted. He looked as though he had walked a short distance from somewhere nearby. There was nowhere nearby. Before asking for water, he looked at the radio and wanted to know when I was expected to check in again. I gave a vague answer. He drank half a cup and studied the checkpoint. How many runners were still out? Was I staying until dark? Did the sweep team come from the same direction as the runners? None of the questions were outrageous by themselves. Together, they bothered me. He claimed his brother was competing. He couldn't give me a name or a bib number. Then he changed it and said it might have been his cousin. I told him only registered crew were allowed near the course. He nodded as though that was useful information. Then he walked back towards the west and disappeared behind a low ridge. I radioed race control. The connection broke up, but I managed to report an unknown person near the checkpoint. They told me a course marshal would check the area. Nobody came. 20 minutes later, 2 runners arrived together. One was limping, the other was angry. A man had approached them about 3 miles back and told them the route had changed. He tried directing them into a dry wash away from the marked trail. They ignored him because the course flags still pointed forward. The description matched the stranger. I wanted to close the checkpoint and leave with them. I couldn't. At least 5 runners were still between checkpoints 6 and 7. One had been moving slowly all day and might need medical help. Leaving would have meant abandoning water and first aid at the most isolated part of the course, so the 2 runners stayed. That decision probably changed what happened next. The limping runner sat under the canopy while his friend helped me move the radio and medical box closer together. Neither of us said much about why. We just stopped spreading ourselves out. The sunlight dropped behind the ridge. The desert went from hot to cold almost immediately. That was when we saw the stranger again. He was standing on the ridge west of the checkpoint. This time, someone was with him. They didn't wave. They didn't come closer. They stood there for several minutes, watching us. Then both disappeared below the ridge. I tried the radio again. No response. The runner beside me asked whether I had any kind of weapon. I had a small folding knife meant for cutting tape. He had trekking poles. That was it. Another runner arrived shortly before dark. He had taken a fall and needed his knee wrapped. While I worked on it, we heard something move behind the supply tent. Not the wind. The water containers shifted against each other. The runner's friend turned on his headlamp and went around the side. Nobody was there, but the large reserve water bag had been cut open. Water was draining into the sand, one clean slice near the bottom. We dragged the remaining containers beneath the canopy. That changed the situation. It wasn't just somebody watching. Someone was trying to disable the checkpoint. The sweep team was already late. We had no working radio connection, and if the final runners arrived without water, we couldn't leave them. The stranger called from somewhere beyond the light. He said he had found one of our course markers. Nobody answered. A reflective flag landed in the sand near the canopy, then another. They had been pulled from the trail. The 3 runners and I stayed together. We aimed every headlamp towards the darkness and waited. For almost 40 minutes, nothing happened. No voices, no footsteps, no movement. That silence was worse than a confrontation would have been. It gave us time to imagine how easily someone could approach from any direction. The desert around Checkpoint 7 was completely open during daylight. At night, our own lights made everything beyond them invisible. The sweep vehicle finally arrived from the north. I have never been so relieved to see headlights. The course marshal was with them, along with 2 medics. We loaded the injured runners and reported everything. They searched the ridge with spotlights. The 2 men were gone. The next morning, sheriff's deputies found a camp in a shallow ravine less than half a mile west of the checkpoint. there was a stolen utility vehicle hidden beneath camouflage netting, along with fuel cans, power tools, and equipment taken from remote construction sites. They also found printed race maps. Checkpoint 7 had been circled. The deputies believed the men had planned to steal the support vehicle and supplies after the checkpoint was abandoned. That explanation made sense. Most of it anyway. What didn't make sense was directing exhausted runners away from the marked course, or cutting open water in a place where somebody could have died without it. Race control called the whole thing an attempted theft. Maybe that's what it was, but thieves usually wait until the place is empty. They don't walk into the light first and ask exactly when everyone will know you're alone. There was food in the refrigerator, not much. Half an onion wrapped in plastic, mustard, a jar of pickles with one left in it. That probably doesn't sound frightening. It shouldn't, but the lodge had been locked since the end of hunting season, and I was the person who unlocked it. I was 31, and the lodge belonged to my father-in-law and 2 of his friends. It was in northern Maine, far enough from the nearest town that they kept fuel, canned food, and spare parts there year-round. They used it for hunting and fishing. I used it when they needed free labor. That weekend, I had agreed to open the place before 6 other guys arrived the following morning. My job was simple: start the generator, turn on the water, check the propane, clean up any dead mice, and make sure the bedrooms were usable. The last 18 miles were on logging roads. After that, there was nothing. No neighboring cabins, no cell service, no electricity except what the generator provided. The lodge sat beside a narrow lake surrounded by dense trees. In summer, it was beautiful. In late November, with the water black and the sky getting dark at 4 in the afternoon, it felt a lot less welcoming. The front door was locked. The windows were intact. Nothing looked disturbed. Then I opened the refrigerator. At first, I assumed one of the owners had left the food behind in October, but the onion hadn't dried out. The plastic wrap was still tight. The mustard bottle was cold. That meant the refrigerator had been running recently. It was powered by the generator. The generator was off when I arrived. I checked it because I thought maybe it had shut down that morning. The fuel valve was closed. The engine was cold. There was a film of dust across the controls. I started it and went back inside. The lights came on. That was when I noticed the coffee maker. The glass pot had been washed and placed upside down on a towel beside the sink. My father-in-law never washed anything at that lodge. None of them did. Their usual system was to leave a pan soaking until the next trip. Someone else had cleaned it. I went through the rooms, nothing missing, no broken locks, no obvious bedding used. In the smallest bedroom, the window was open about an inch. The room smelled like cigarettes. Nobody in the group smoked. I closed the window and checked outside, but there were no footprints I could make out. The ground was frozen and covered with pine needles. I considered leaving. I really did, but I was already there. It was getting dark, and the others planned to arrive around 6 the next morning. Turning around would have meant almost 3 hours on logging roads at night, followed by explaining why I had left without finishing anything. So I did what people usually do when something feels wrong, but not wrong enough. I made excuses for it. Maybe one of the owners had come up without telling anyone. Maybe the caretaker had checked the place. Maybe the food wasn't as fresh as it looked. I kept working. Around 7, I made dinner and sat near the wood stove with the television playing a DVD because there was no reception. Every now and then, the building made a noise. Wood contracting, wind pressing against the siding, small animals under the porch. Normal cabin sounds. Then, something rolled across the floor above me. The lodge didn't have a second floor. It had an attic. The sound was slow and uneven, like a glass bottle rolling a few feet and settling against something. I turned the television down. Nothing else happened. The attic hatch was in the hallway ceiling. It had a folding ladder, but we almost never used it. There was nothing up there except insulation and old fishing gear. I stood beneath it for a while. The hatch was closed. I decided not to open it. That decision probably saved me from doing something much worse. Instead, I took a chair and wedged it beneath the hatch. Then I checked every door again. The back door was unlocked. I was certain I had locked it. The deadbolt was turned open, but the door itself hadn't moved. I locked it and stood there listening. The woods outside were completely silent. No engine, no footsteps, no voices. I picked up my phone, even though I knew it had no service. That's when I noticed my keys were missing from the table. I found them 10 minutes later. They were inside the refrigerator, on the top shelf, beside the mustard. I hadn't put them there. I know people always say things like that in stories, and maybe memory isn't perfect. Maybe I had set them down while checking the food, but I had driven to the lodge with those keys in my hand, opened the front door, and placed them on the table beside my gloves. I can still see them lying there. Finding them in the refrigerator removed every excuse I had left. Someone was inside the lodge. Not someone who had been there before. Someone who was there with me. I grabbed the flashlight and the hatchet we kept beside the stove. I didn't call out. I didn't search the rooms again. I went straight to the front door. As I reached it, the chair beneath the attic hatch scraped across the hallway floor. Only an inch or two, but enough. I stepped outside and locked the door behind me. My truck was parked maybe 30 yards away. I didn't go to it. The keys had been out of my sight. I didn't know what had been done to the truck, and I didn't want to stand in front of it trying to start the engine while someone watched from the lodge. There was a small equipment shed farther down the lake shore. I went there instead. The shed had no heat, but it had a solid door and a sliding bolt on the inside. I stayed there all night with the hatchet across my knees. At some point after midnight, the lodge generator shut off. It didn't run out of fuel. The engine stopped cleanly. Someone had turned it off. The darkness after that was complete. A few minutes later, I saw a flashlight moving between the lodge and my truck. It stayed low, near the ground. The person never came towards the shed. That almost made it worse. Whoever it was knew the property well enough to search quietly and take their time. The others arrived shortly after 6. They found me in the shed looking ridiculous and half frozen. We went through the lodge together. The attic hatch was open. The chair had been pushed aside. Upstairs, behind several rolls of insulation, someone had made a sleeping area. Blankets, food wrappers, candles, a plastic container used as a toilet. There was a narrow opening at the far end of the attic where part of the wall had been removed. It led down into a pantry through the space behind the shelves. That was how someone had been moving through the lodge without using the rooms normally. The police searched the woods but found nobody. They believed a local man had been using seasonal properties for shelter. Apparently, there had been similar break-ins, but the owners hadn't reported much missing and assumed teenagers were responsible. The thing that bothered the police was the length of time. The sleeping area wasn't temporary. The wood around the opening had been worn smooth, where someone had climbed through repeatedly. My father-in-law had owned that lodge for 9 years. They had spent dozens of weekends there, sometimes with their wives, sometimes with children. No one had ever checked behind the insulation. They sealed the opening and replaced every lock. A locksmith came out from town to do it properly. While removing the old front door lock, he found scratches inside the cylinder from a badly cut duplicate key. Under the mattress in the attic, police found 2 keys. One fit the lodge, the other was brand new. It fit the replacement lock the locksmith had installed that morning.